Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Julia Cutler, and I want to take a minute to say thanks for joining us today. Hope you're all doing well. I hope I'm happy that you joined us today with Sam Walker, who will be talking to us about leadership lessons from the greatest captains in sports history. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia.
We're excited to have you here today. I'll give some quick housekeeping information for our audience and then tell you a little bit more about Sam. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please click the Ask a Question button below the video to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Also, as a reminder, the recording will be available tomorrow. Now, to properly introduce Sam. Sam Walker is the Wall Street Journal's leadership columnist and the author of The Captain Class, which was named one of the best business books of 2017 by CNBC, Amazon, the New York Times, Strategy Plus Business, and Sports Illustrated. Walker joined the Journal in 1998 as a sports writer and sports columnist. In 2009, he became the founding editor of the paper's prize-winning daily sports coverage. He later served as the Journal's deputy page one editor. In addition to writing his column, Walker is a frequent keynote speaker for business groups. He also serves as a team-building consultant and coach for companies, military units, and professional, collegiate, and Olympic sports teams, including the NFL's Chicago Bears. Walker is a two-time champion of Tout Wars, the elite fantasy baseball competition that was the subject of his best-selling book, Fantasyland. Welcome, Sam, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you, Julia. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I want to talk about the research that I've done on leadership, but before I get into that, I think it's important to back up and ask another question, which is really the question that started this whole process for me, and that's this. What makes great teams great? So this was an obsession of mine that grew over time and really peaked when I was a sports columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I had a very weird and strange job in that I didn't cover any particular sport or any particular team. I really focused on the major championships. So I would go to the Super Bowl and the World Series and the World Cup and the Olympics. And the only thing that I ever saw with any great regularity were great teams, championship caliber teams at the height of their power. And I studied them very closely. I was obsessed with trying to figure out what it was that made them so exceptional. But I had trouble putting my finger on it. You know, I thought maybe it was talent, but some teams had abundant talent, others didn't. It didn't turn out to be brilliant tactics or money and resources either. So I really wasn't sure what it was. So I did the only thing I knew to do, which was I started asking people. I mean, every time I had a minute with one of these athletes, I would ask them the same simple question. Why? Why is this team so much better than every other team? And they answer the question usually with a lot of the cliches that you've probably heard a million times. But what really came across to me was that it wasn't a subject they had really given a lot of thought to. Being on a great team, even an elite team, it didn't feel like an out-of-body experience. It didn't feel like aliens were controlling you. It actually felt very normal, almost natural. It felt like everything was just functioning the way that it should. And everyone just kind of instinctively knew how to play along. I asked Tom Brady this question once, and he said something he's often said, which is he said, you do your job so that everybody else can do their job. There's no big secret to it. I walked away thinking, okay, Tom, sure, right? 6 Super Bowls, 2 different teams, right? I mean, just doing your job, right? Nothing to see here. I was convinced that there was something more to it. So what I decided to do was to actually undertake a study. I was going to try to crack the code. So I was going to come up with a list of the greatest teams in the history of sports. And from there, I would try to figure out the common ingredient, the thing that they all had to have in order to be great. I quickly realized that this was going to be a very long and difficult job because no one had ever really done that before. There was no objective scientific list of which teams in sports were really the greatest in history. So I had to define really a lot of things, what constitutes a team, but also what constitutes greatness. I discovered that there was no one statistic or algorithm that you could use. Sports are so different. They value greatness and excellence in different ways. So I came up with 8 tests that I believed that a team would have to pass in order to be considered one of the greatest teams in the history of sports. Some of them were simple things. I mean, they had to have played at the highest level of competition in their sport against the other great teams of the time. They had to have done something unique in the history of their sport in terms of the number of championships won or winning percentage over time, something no other team had done. But the thing that really narrowed it down for me was that I realized I didn't want to study these teams that had had one great undefeated season or even 2. What I was interested in was sustained greatness, teams that had built a culture of winning that was repeatable. So I set the floor at 4 years minimum of absolute dominance, global dominance in a sport. And that really narrowed the list down considerably. So in the end, I came up with 17 teams that I believe are the greatest teams in sports history. Now, we can debate this all day long. I love to. It's usually better over a beer or 2 or 7. But I wasn't trying to solve the greatest barstool debate in history. I really just wanted a sample of teams that I thought were worthy of this study. Now, if you look at this list, there may be some teams you recognize or remember, but there's some I'm not sure about. The Cuban women's volleyball team from the 1990s. Remember them? No, you don't remember them. I guarantee you don't remember them. I knew nothing about them. This is the greatest Olympic team of all time. Period, men or women. I mean, for 10 years, they did not lose a single match of any consequence. And this is a team from a tiny, poor, politically repressed country that didn't have a great volleyball tradition. So all of these teams were like that. They were freaks. They were outliers. Their accomplishments were quite literally off the charts. My thought was that if I isolate and I study this group, if there is some secret DNA, some secret ingredient of great teams, it would have to be present. All these teams would have to have that thing. So this was my study group, and I began looking closely at these teams to try to figure out what they had in common. Again, I ran into some of the same problems. I thought maybe it would be talent, but some teams had enormous talent. Others were not the most talented. Again, it wasn't brilliant tactics. It wasn't money and resources. I really thought it would be coaching. My thinking was that coaches probably are the ones who sow the seeds of a dynasty, right? But to my absolute shock, only one of these teams had a coach who was already considered to be a great coach before this run of excellence began. In fact, all the others either had a coach who had a mediocre record, had been fired from a previous job, or had very little or no coaching experience at all. In fact, some of these teams changed coaches in the middle of their runs and continued to win. So I am not saying that coaches don't matter and that talent and tactics don't matter. All those things are important, but they're not the one thing that has to be present in order to create a great dynasty. In the end, there was one thing, and it was a huge surprise to me because it was the clearest pattern I've ever seen jump out of a giant pile of data before. And it was a giant pile of data. I looked at tens of thousands of teams in 37 different categories of sports since the 1880s all over the world. But all of the teams in this 17 and farther down the list, the other 100 that were very close, all had one thing in common. The beginning of their winning streak and the end corresponded very closely, if not precisely, to the arrival and departure of one player. And in every single case, that player was the leader of the team or the captain. So, captains, right? This is not where I thought I would end up. I didn't realize that the leader of the player leader of the team could have such a significant impact. And I didn't entirely believe in it. I had to kick the tires in a million ways. But the biggest surprise to me was when I started looking at these captains, I got very confused. First of all, my first question was, in many cases, who are these people? Right? I mean, some of them I knew who they were, but there were other times where I knew the team very well, but I didn't know who the captain was, and I didn't know anything about that specific player. Very few of them were superstars. Most of them were people that you wouldn't notice or hadn't necessarily heard of. Definitely not the face of the team. But beyond that, it got even stranger because when I looked at their personal characteristics and the way that they interacted with their teammates, their personal qualities, a lot of the things that they did were things that I thought would disqualify people from leadership. I realized that all of my assumptions and prejudices about leadership might be wrong. And I started to think, where do they come from, right? I mean, where do we get our ideas about leadership? I guess I got mine from Hollywood, right? I got it from the movies, this idea of what a leader looks like and what a leader does. But I started to think that I needed to re-examine them and think more closely. So over many years, I interviewed all the living captains on this list and talked to all their teammates and everyone ever played with them and did all the research I possibly could. And I found that they were very different people. And you can see they had different races and genders and ethnicities and played at different times. They had different personalities as well. But what I found is that when I looked at the moments, the crucial moments where their dynasties were on the line and someone needed to do something to pull the team through, when I looked at how they behaved in those moments, I started to see a pattern, and it was incredibly clear. In fact, the way they approached leadership was identical in every single case. They were almost carbon copies of each other. They all approached leadership exactly the same way. So in the end, I came up with this list of qualities, traits that they had in common, things they actually used in competition to make their teams better. And here's the list. These are the 7 traits of elite captains. And I'll get back to this slide. The one thing I will say is when you read this list, I would assume it's different from the list you would have made if I asked you what the 7 traits were. Certainly different from mine. A lot of these things were completely off of my radar. Now, I can't get into all of them, but I want to go through a few of them to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. And I want to start with relentlessness and toughness. So this one is probably the most obvious. It's the one that most people would think that a great leader would have, right? They never give in. They're very committed to the task. But these captains took it to unbelievable extremes. I mean, they set records for consecutive minutes played. And what I found was they only had one speed in competition, which was completely flat out. And what was interesting was it did not matter what the situation was. It could be winning by 10 goals, losing by 50 points. It was the same level of effort. And they were always trying to keep their teammates engaged as well. They were also incredibly tough. I mean, they played through a litany of injuries that were really unbelievable. I mean, it ranges from a broken foot to a fractured skull, a heart attack in the middle of a world championship, kept playing. And one of these captains had his, there's no polite way to say this, had his scrotum ripped open during a rugby match and continued to play. So the pain threshold was there, but I think so was the commitment. I want to give you a little example. This is Carlos Puyol, and Puyol was the captain of this great Barcelona professional soccer team that, in my mind, is the greatest pro soccer team in the history of the sport, which is really saying something. But Puyol was not the face of that team. They had Lionel Messi, who was the big star of that team. He was probably the worst athlete on the team. Definitely not the best player. But if you watch the way he played, you'll see the mentality of a great captain. He was always working very hard to keep his teammates focused and on point and making sure they weren't getting distracted. He hated celebrations. He would immediately break it up. He didn't want to give the other team any ammunition that they could use to mount a comeback. But if you watch the way he played, here he takes a ball directly to the face and just watch him pop right back up. This is my favorite clip. So he's bleeding. He's got a head clash, a gash in his head. He has to get a staple. Now he tries to grab the gun and do it himself here. Then he gets the staple. And watch him. He pops right back up, put me back in. It's that level of just absolute relentless intensity that all of these captains had. So your question is probably, okay, what does that mean for me as a leader? What does that mean for leaders in other contexts? Well, I think the obvious thing is there's really no chill day. I mean, if you want to be a great leader, you need to roll up your sleeves and give the same level of effort no matter what's going on, no matter what the circumstances are. But there's more to it than that. The reason that it's important, the reason that it makes teams better is something that's actually rooted in science. So back in 1911, a French engineer named Max Ringelmann conducted this experiment where he had his very dapper students pull on a rope. And he had them do this first individually, and then he had them do it together as a team. And he would measure the force that they applied to that rope. Now, his hypothesis in this experiment was that every time he added someone to the pulling group, there would be an exponential increase in the force applied. Basically, he thought that a team is going to be stronger than the sum of its parts. Now, the hypothesis was not correct. In fact, the experiment was a complete failure. He actually proved the reverse. Every time he added someone to that pulling group, he discovered the average force that each person applied to the rope actually went down. It declined. In other words, people were not working as hard on the task in the group setting as they did by themselves. Now, this is called social loafing, and it's a phenomenon that's been proven hundreds of times in laboratory experiments. And I think it goes a long way to explaining why there are so few great teams, because it's human nature. The very act of joining a team tends to diminish our inclination to work as hard as we can. So some of this is in the DNA of human beings, right? But here's the thing. Here's the thing about effort and relentlessness and toughness. There's an antidote to social loafing, which scientists have proven. They found in studies that is very simple. If you want to counteract the effect, if you want people to work just as hard in a team setting as they do by themselves, all that needs to happen is that there's a perception that one person on that team, ideally the leader of the team, is a maximum effort performer who always gives 100%. If that perception exists inside the group, people will work just as hard collectively as they do by themselves. In other words, you've eliminated the inertia and the performance decline that comes from social loafing. So that's what this is about. That relentlessness and that toughness. You can't see it, but when other people see it in you and they believe that it exists in you, they're going to work harder. And this is how you sustain excellence, because over time, there is a marginal increase in performance, which becomes a massive advantage as the years and the months go on. So it's so important for you as a leader, if you want to sustain greatness, to absolutely put in maximum effort all the time. Okay, another one is ironclad emotional control. And I'm going to go back to Tom Brady on this one. Now, what I discovered with these captains was I found many situations where they endured some awful situation, either a personal tragedy or a humiliation or a snub by the coach or something really awful that most of us would not be able to play through or focus through. What I found was not only were they able to take those negative feelings and put them aside and table them and continue to compete, they were often better in those circumstances than they were otherwise. There was this incredible ability to turn emotion on and use emotion when it was helpful to the team, to show passion and to show commitment. But as soon as it was not helpful, when it became negative or when there might be consequences for it, they would shut it off. Like they had a switch internally, and they were incredibly good at it. And I bring Tom Brady up here because it's not often discussed about him, but a couple times in his career, he has shown this level of emotional control that's really remarkable. The first blow was when he had that awful season where he was suspended for deflating the footballs by the NFL and came back, and a lot of people would be distracted or humiliated or have a tough time getting going. Brady had one of his best seasons ever, blew through the playoffs and won the Super Bowl. After the game, though, we learned something we didn't know, which is that his mother, during all of that, had been going through chemotherapy intensively for cancer and had just sort of gotten on her feet. So Brady didn't say anything about that. He didn't mention it to his teammates. He just, some of them knew, but he put it away, and he was able to set that aside and deal with it in the moment, but also be fully present and better than ever in the team setting. Now, just this past year, you saw that Brady won another Super Bowl with a new team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. One of the stories that got lost was that in his first game, his father was in the hospital and it was touch and go with COVID-19. It was the first game he had never attended of his son's entire football career. Brady didn't play that well in that first game. In the second game, under the same circumstances, he led his team to victory. But again, we didn't know this because he didn't say anything about it. He didn't bring it to the office. Why is this important to mention? Because I think as leaders, one very important thing to remember is that like relentlessness and toughness, certain emotions are contagious. And if you as the leader are able to continue to perform at a high level, even when you're going through difficult personal circumstances, and you're able to control your emotion, it's contagious. It has a contagious effect. Other people on your team will also do a better job of doing the same thing. So again, over the long term, this has huge dividends. But it's very important for you as the leader to make sure that you're in control and that you're using emotion positively and never in a negative way. All right, another one, carrying the water. Now, this was probably, among the largest surprises of all in my research. If you saw that list of captains, you probably noticed that some of those people were not superstars. In fact, very few of the captains on my list were like Tom Brady, were stars on their teams. Most of them were absolutely the reverse. Most of them were players you didn't really notice. They were central defenders. They were people who did a lot of the thankless grunt work behind the scenes. They certainly were not the best athletes. They led in a different way. And I was very confused by this. I didn't understand how you can lead in the shadows, because these people were not only not the best players, all of them were not interested in attention. They were not charismatic people who wanted to be celebrities. In fact, they seemed very uncomfortable being singled out from their teammates. They only cared about honors that celebrated the entire team. They were very humble, kind of self-effacing people. I didn't understand this at all. And so I went immediately to one of the most glaring examples I could find. And it's this person, Carla Overbeck. Now, if you remember Carla Overbeck, huge congratulations to you, because almost nobody remembers her. You remember her team. It was that 1999 U.S. women's soccer team that won the World Cup. A team that had Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy and Brandi Chastain. I mean, incredible, telegenic, charismatic, great superstar players. Who nobody remembers is Carla Overbeck. Even though she was the captain of the team, no one remembers Carla Overbeck. And there's a reason no one remembers her, because Carla Overbeck did not care if anyone knew who she was or if her accomplishments and contributions were celebrated. Now, I'm not exaggerating. When they won the World Cup, the entire team, they flew to New York for a ticker tape parade, and they were on all the late night shows. Only one member of the team did not go, and it was Carla Overbeck. She was happy for her teammates to be soaking up the adulation, but she wanted no part of it. They had won the trophy. That's all she cared about. She flew home. I asked her what she did that day that her teammates were celebrating in Times Square, and she said 3 loads of laundry. So that was Carla. Again, this was very confusing to me, because she was someone who was in the shadow. She was not someone you would necessarily notice. In fact, I tried to find a clip of her playing to show you, and she's not someone the camera really ever gravitated to. In fact, this is all I could find. Here's Carla. She's directing a little traffic. She's talking, and then boom, she's off camera. That's it. The last person you would notice unless you were looking for her. So I didn't understand how she led, because she essentially led from the back. So I called one of her former coaches, and I had a long talk with him, and I said, explain Carla's leadership. He said, I'll tell you a story. The team would go on these long road trips to Japan or Norway, right? And they would be exhausted, and they would collapse in their hotel room and want to go to bed, and there'd be a knock on the door, and they would open up the door, and here's Carla. And Carla's carrying their luggage. She's helping the equipment guys carry the luggage for the players from the bus to their rooms for them. As the captain of the U.S. national soccer team doing this. I said, well, that's very nice of her, but I don't understand. Again, how is that leadership? He said, here's what Carla was. Carla knew exactly what she was doing. She did all kinds of small acts of service to the team, selfless things that made it very clear to teammates that she cared more about the collective and the outcome of the team than she cared about herself. And that was very clear. And it gave her this credibility with her teammates, this capital. But she would use that credibility. She used that capital on the field when it mattered. If you missed a 50-50 ball and your head wasn't in the game, she was the first person over there to tell you to get it together. If you did something great, she was the first person there to congratulate you. She was very vocal, and she spoke to her teammates in those crucial moments. But when she spoke to them, they all knew it wasn't about her ego. It was about, she was speaking on behalf of the team itself. That's an incredibly powerful way to lead. She had enormous influence on that team. And the fact that she wasn't a superstar was important, because as a central defender, she would lay the ball off the minute she got it to one of her more talented teammates. But her teammates needed her approval. They needed those passes. So she was able to control the team emotionally and tactically from this rearward position where you would never notice her. And she never said anything or got any attention whatsoever. But she was, by all accounts, everyone on that team will tell you, she was the heart and soul and the engine that drove them. So what's the lesson for all of us? It's very confusing. I mean, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but most of us need some sort of reassurance and validation. We like to be recognized, right? We like to be celebrated. We want to be seen as the face of the effort, right? The problem is that doesn't comport with being a great leader. In fact, if you are getting all the accolades and you are the face of the team, there's a chance you're doing it wrong. As the leader, you genuinely have to say, I care about this team's success, and I do not care how I'm perceived. I do not care if other people are promoted ahead of me. If I don't get the recognition that others get, that has to be enough. The team's success has to be enough for you. I'm just the messenger here. All these captains had this mentality. They were not in it for self-aggrandizement, for their own purposes. They really cared more about the team's success than they cared about themselves. It's not an easy way to lead. It's not for all of us, but that is one of the traits that help these captains sustain excellence. All right, so I want to talk about another one, and this one is especially relevant for business, is practical communication. Now, I would say probably the biggest surprise that I had of all during this research was, I had this idea that when you're a leader and you're communicating with a team, especially a sports team, I mean, there's one major way that you do that, right? I mean, you give the big speech, right? Every Hollywood movie has a great speech in it, right? We celebrate these great locker room oratory. But to my absolute astonishment, not one of these captains, and I'm not exaggerating, not one of them liked to give speeches. Some of them would do it, usually kept their remarks a little short, but some of them never did. I asked Carlos Puyol once, I said, well, how did you address the team? What would you say? He said, I never did. And never once in his entire career as the captain of that great team did he ever talk to the team as a group. He didn't think he was any good at it, but he also didn't think it mattered. He didn't think it was important, or he thought it was kind of corny and not necessary. This was very confusing to me. I wanted to know, if they didn't give speeches, how do they communicate with their teammates? So I went again to what I thought was the most glaring example of all. And this is Tim Duncan. If you don't remember Tim Duncan, he was the great star and captain of the San Antonio Spurs, which is one of the great underrated dynasties in sports history. I mean, he never missed the playoffs in an 18-year playing career. They won 5 titles, and they have the highest long-term winning percentage of any team in NBA history, and no one will ever touch that number. And Tim Duncan was at the center of all of that, one of the great leaders of all time. But if you know anything about Tim Duncan, you probably know that he had the personality of a vacuum cleaner. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. If you watch him give an interview, he looked like he was getting a colonoscopy. I mean, he hated talking to reporters. He hated attention. He really did not want to be singled out from his teammates at all. A lot of people called him the most boring superstar in the history of sports, and I think that's probably accurate. So my question was, okay, well, how does Tim Duncan communicate, right? So I spent a lot of time with this team, and I watched them in different settings, practice, off the court, on the bench. And the first thing you notice about the Spurs was they talked more than any team I've ever seen in professional sports. I mean, constant running dialogue between them, always talking about everything, tactics, movies, anything, a very talkative group. And what I realized was that Tim Duncan might be very quiet and retreating in public, but inside the team, he was very vocal. And he was in the middle of this. He was always seeking out teammates to have conversations with them. And I have a little clip of him in action. If you watch him, he would make this piercing eye contact with people. He would engage with them very intensely. He would always be minding his teammates and having these little interactions with them. But if you watch him, he would give speeches. He would pull them aside away from the group, and he would have a conversation in which he would listen as much as he spoke. And that was very important. That eye contact, that engagement, he would use facial expressions and gestures as well. So he was very animated, and he would always make sure that he was making that sort of personal connection and sending that message very clearly to his teammates, even if they were just coming off the court, making very intense eye contact with them. So how does that work? How does that create communication? Well, here's the thing about Tim Duncan. Nothing festered on the Spurs, because the minute something went wrong, Tim Duncan was all over it. He would pull that person aside. He would have a very intense one-on-one conversation, and he would learn how to get through to people. He would learn what made them tick and how to communicate with everyone. He had a different communication plan for everyone on the team, but he was very approachable. Everyone felt comfortable approaching him. His teammates said if you walked into practice, you would never know he was the leader of the team. He didn't command attention. He was always working behind the scenes and looking vigilantly for anything that needed his attention. And he would engage, and he would engage intensely, and he would listen, and he would have a conversation with that person in real time. So there were no festering problems. Nothing will kill a team faster than a problem everyone can see but no one will acknowledge. And that never happened on the Spurs. It was a huge benefit. That level of communication allowed them to bring people into that culture, and they would join that talkative culture, and they knew that they would be held accountable for making a mistake, but they would also be heard. And that running dialogue is so important. All the research into elite teams and other fields has concurred that communication, having a communicator of that nature in the middle of a team, is super important in terms of maintaining consistent high performance. So what's the lesson for us? Well, I think this is a liberating one for all of you, whatever leadership position you're in. You don't have to have a silver tongue. You don't have to be a great orator. It's not about the quality of your words and inspiration. It's about quantity. The problem is you just have to put the work in. It's a 24/7 job. You have to constantly be scanning your team for anything that needs your attention and delivering it in the moment. It's a very difficult and exhausting road. It's not something that comes naturally to all of us, but it's a consistent pattern. And I saw it with all of these great captains. That's the way they communicated. All right. I want to do one more before we move on. So I want to give you a sense of something else about these captains, which was very interesting to me. I've painted a picture so far that makes them seem sort of angelic, right? But they had an edge to them. And I was often shocked at how far they would go to protest something that they thought was not in their team's best interest. I mean, they would go to the mattresses over small things. They were big things, matters of personnel and strategy, but something as small as what the players were being served for dinner. I mean, they would, if they didn't think it was helpful to the team's ability to perform, they would dissent, and they would stand alone and apart. And it didn't matter if they're staying apart from their teammates or their coaches or the league or the conference they played for. They were not afraid to stand apart from their teammates and take a very difficult, unpopular position if they thought it mattered. And a lot of times it's created great problems for them. My favorite example was Valery Vasilyev, and he was the captain of this great Soviet hockey team, one of the great dynasties in the history of sports. What you remember about them, though, probably is the Miracle on Ice. This game where a bunch of American college amateurs beat the Russian juggernaut in Lake Placid and humiliated them. This was just a terrible humiliation for the team, but also for the Soviet Union. I mean, Pravda, the paper of the regime, didn't even print the result. They just pretended it never happened. It was so awful. The story you haven't heard, though, is what happened afterwards. So after this game, the Soviet coach told his players, listen, this was a collective disaster. We all share the blame for what happened out there. And then they went and they got on the plane and they were flying back to Moscow. And on that plane, the coach, Viktor Tikhonov, was up in first class with his dignitaries and his assistant coaches. And he was telling a totally different story. He was saying this player was awful and this person was terrible. He was singling out individual players for the loss, which is what he said he wouldn't do, right? Well, unbeknownst to him, about 15 feet away in the cockpit of the airplane with the door open was Vasilyev, who had gone up there to sort of talk to the pilots during the long flight. And he heard every word his coach had said, and he was not happy. In fact, he was furious that his coach was saying this. What would you do in this situation, right? Soviet Union, they could throw you in the gulag for, spitting your gum on the sidewalk if they wanted to. Well, here's what he did. He came running out of that cockpit, and he grabbed his coach by the neck, and he started shaking him, choking him. He said, I will throw you off this plane right now if you don't take it back. So long story short, he didn't choke his coach out, right? His teammates intervened and they hauled him back to the back of the plane. But everyone on the plane thought, well, that's the last we're ever going to see of this guy, right? We're never going to see him again. So to everyone's shock, though, a few days later, they'd practice in Moscow, and the door flies open, in comes Vasilyev. He sits down, puts on his skates, grabs his stick, goes out on the ice, says, hey, coach, hey, guys, like nothing ever happened. He was completely over it. It had been a moment, and it had passed, and he let it go, and he was back to work. This was very confusing to me. But I started to see that in these moments of dissent, even one that extreme, there was a pattern with these great leaders. What they would do is they were able to have these arguments and these big conflicts that could get very heated, but they weren't personal. There's two kinds of conflict. There's personal conflict, which is really a conflict when you just don't like somebody. That's really what's going on behind the conflict. But then there's something called task conflict. Task conflict is when you're really concerned about the performance of the group or getting it right. It's not personal. It's about the outcome. And there's a difference, a profound difference between them, but they look the same. In this case, you choke somebody, you probably don't like them, right? It seemed about as personal as it can get, but it wasn't. It was about holding that team together in a very precarious moment. And what happened? Well, to everyone's surprise, to no one's surprise, his teammates elected him captain, but the Kremlin let it stand and his coach let it stand. That was the moment. That's when they became the greatest team in the history of hockey. From that day on, they absolutely dominated the global sport. They played a group of NHL All-Stars with Wayne Gretzky and Guy Lafleur and Bobby Orr, the greatest All-Star team in the history of Canadian hockey, and they beat them 8-1. Just wiped them off the ice, right? They were unstoppable. So out of this moment where the whole team should have fallen apart, they actually became stronger. And it's hard not to believe that act of principled dissent on the part of Vasilyev had something to do with it. So look, here's the lesson. And I am not telling you to choke your boss. Please don't choke your boss. This is not acceptable behavior. But the point I'm trying to make is that there is a quality to leadership that's often ignored, which is sometimes it's lonely. And sometimes it takes enormous personal courage because you have to stand apart from everybody if you truly believe that something is going wrong and something is getting in the way of the team's goals. Everyone might be happier with the decision, but if you don't think it's going to achieve the outcome you want, you have to be willing to stand apart. Again, it's something that's not natural to all of us, not always taught in business school, but it's essential to maintaining an elite dynasty, a team that wins over a long period of time. So, all right, we talked about some of that stuff. I want to talk a little bit about business teams, and then I want to get to your questions. So, business teams, obviously, they're a little different than sports teams, right? You don't have a goalpost in a field, and not everyone's playing by the same rules. So there are some differences, but in all the work that I've done with business and military and sports, I've seen that really ultimately the interpersonal team dynamics and the leadership dynamics inside a team are pretty universal. Now, here's the thing about business teams that I think we should all be concerned about. A few years ago, a bunch of researchers did a huge survey where they asked thousands of workers across many different industries to rate the team that they were currently on. And the highest rating you could give your team was excellent, right? I just want you to think in your own mind what percentage of response you think said they were on excellent teams. I'm not going to keep you in suspense. It was 15%. 15%. I mean, I found that number to be astonishing. I mean, that is 85% of the teams out there in the business world are, according to their participants, are either mediocre or lousy. I mean, that's a lot. And we all know how important teams are. I mean, think about teams in a business context. Every great work of architecture, science, engineering, medicine, every great product is really a monument to teamwork, to a great superior collective effort, right? Teams are everything. Teams are what make us different from every species on the planet, our ability to work together toward difficult goals. And we have been on this planet as a species for hundreds of thousands of years, right? We've had a lot of practice. I mean, you think we'd be able to hit a number maybe a little bit higher than 15%, right? Well, we haven't, and this is a problem. I think we have a real problem. We have to make our teams better. Now, as I as I move around through the business world and talk to leaders about some of the problems that they're having, these seem to be the 7 most universal challenges. It's engagement, retention, flexibility, sense of purpose, all of these things I hear over and over again. It may sound self-serving, but what I'm going to tell you is that all of these problems, I think, can be mitigated to some extent, if not solved, by one thing, and it's great teams. I don't care if you're a millennial or you're just out of college, you're a Gen X, you're a boomer. I don't care what your personal beliefs or circumstances are. Everybody loves to be on a great team. And when you're on a great team, it feels natural. We're all kind of wired in a way to just play along, to play our part. If you're on a great team, you're going to be more loyal. You're going to be more productive. You're more likely to stick around, and you're going to feel that sense of mission and purpose that will bind you to your work. So what's the key to building better teams, to building teams that have that kind of a commitment and passion? Well, don't take it from me. I mean, obviously, you know what I think, but Gallup recently did this massive study, one of the biggest studies they've ever done. And they reached a conclusion they think is the most emphatic conclusion they have ever reached from doing a study of teams in business. They found that 72% of the variation between the engagement level of teams in business has to do with the quality of the manager. So again, it's about leadership. It really comes down to the person who's running the team and how good they are and how they run that team and what skills they bring to the table. Okay, so the question I get a lot about this book is, you've done this research, are great leaders made or born? Can we expect that even if we're not a leader, don't see ourselves that way, can we become one? I have a very simple answer to this question. I mean, look at these 7 traits again. It's important to look at the traits that are here, but it's also important to look at what's not on this list. And what's not on this list: God-given ability, skill, superior talent, charisma, all of those things that you have to be born with, right? I mean, it's great to have those qualities. It's not a negative as a leader, but what this shows is it's not required. You don't have to be obvious. You don't have to have these exceptionally obvious qualities to be a great leader. All of these traits have one thing in common. They're about one thing, which is behavior. It's just behavior. Leadership is a pattern of behavior. And when you think about it, it's actually pretty simple. In every situation that you face as a leader, it's almost binary. There's a right decision and a wrong decision. Just knowing what the right decision is, what a leader is supposed to do, is half the battle. And if you make 30%, 40%, 80% better decisions in those moments, you will be a better leader. And what we know about behavior is that humans can change their behavior. We can assume new behaviors. A lot of it is just learning how to do it. Now, here's the problem. I said it's simple, but it's not easy. That's the rub. All the research I've done shows that when you face a leadership situation, the right choice is nearly always the hard one. It's the one that requires a lot more effort from you, a lot more time and emotional labor on your part. So it's not really about whether you're leadership material and that you have the qualities and the personal qualities necessary to lead. It's really about how much do you care and how much are you willing to work? How hard are you willing to work? And can you put the team's goals and outcome ahead of your own? I think one way in business to think about teams in a different way, to think about a strong organization, is to think about being a rower. And what's a rower? Well, a rower is someone, and you know what a rower is. Inside every organization, every business, every team, there are just certain people who row. They just put their own concerns aside, and when it's time to work, they're just man their oar. They're going to get the job done. The rower is the person that you go to and you have a job that just has to be done right, and you really need to know that it's going to be taken care of. You call a rower, right? So these rowers are often not the people who we call to leadership, because they're often content doing their thing. They're not the star performers, right? They're not the people with the great numbers that we think we need to put in a leadership role. The problem is we're making a mistake there, because what happens with rowers is a rower loves nothing more than another rower. So these people will recognize each other, and they will see each other across departments and disciplines. They'll find each other. They have this radar, and they'll work together. They'll help each other. They form this invisible spine that runs through your whole organization. These are these people with these captain class qualities who may not be the obvious people, but they're the ones who hold you together. And when times get tough, if you don't have that spine and those people are not there to pull together, to pull you through, that's when you collapse. That's when everything falls apart. So the ultimate strength of your organization is how many rowers you have. The best thing you can do, the best way you can approach your job is to think of yourself as a rower. The last point I want to make before we get to questions, I've found in my research and my work with teams in professional sports and all different walks of life is that I've talked a lot about great captains. Every team needs a great captain. You need someone who's ultimately responsible for the outcome and is going to run into that burning building if no one else will. But really what I've learned is that leadership is a team sport. There's no such thing as a complete leader. There's so many different roles and leadership functions that need to be done inside a team. Nobody can do them all. Every great leader has to have help, and a great leader will accept and be grateful for it. I have found in my travels 18 different leadership behaviors that are all slightly distinct in some way. A great captain may do a lot of these things, but they need help. And another way to think of yourself on a team, even if you're not the leader, is to think, what can I contribute? What can I add here? Can I be a confidant? Could I be a dissenter? Is there one thing that I can do? Is there one small contribution I can make? Do I have enough time to do it? And that's a different way to look at teams. But really, all the research that I have found that I really appreciate says that that's all it takes. The secret of a great team is that someone is taking care of every important leadership function. It's being done well. It doesn't have to be the leader doing everything. Leadership is not something that you either possess or you don't. It's something you can contribute to, even if you're not designated as the leader of the team. I want to end with my favorite quote from Bill Russell, who I think is the greatest captain in the history of sports. And I won't get into his credentials, but he had this to say about his mindset as a leader. And I think it's probably the best encapsulation of what I'm talking about. He said, "My ego demands for myself the success of my team." Once again, my ego demands for myself the success of my team. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Hi, Sam. That was great. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
We do have a lot of questions to get to, so I'm going to jump right in.
Sure.
Do you think a leader needs some of these traits or all of these traits to be great?
It's a great question. So again, every sport is different and every team is different. And you have to think about what your team wants to accomplish. The most important thing I think to do as a leader is to understand what your team needs to do and what sort of leadership dynamic it needs to function effectively. So in some cases, you will need certain traits like that in abundance, and some you may not need them as much. I think it's important to understand them all, that these are all tools in your tool belt that you can use and that you should be able to use if necessary. But again, as long as you're making good leadership decisions and following through in the context you're in, I think that's the most important thing. What I would say to you, to anyone inside a team, is to say, I'm going to look at the leadership of this team and figure out what it needs and figure out what's missing. Because what's missing is the most important thing. And whether you're the leader or not, I think you can think about, is that a role that I can fill? And can I make a contribution there? So a lot of it is having also flexibility and being able to change your stripes. I mean, there's an element of performance to leadership too. Some of it is about putting on a certain persona because it's helpful to the group, even if it's not inherently who you are, how you feel. So you have to be willing to be flexible and to change and to adapt your leadership style to the group that you have.
Right. In all of these captains that you discussed, did you find that humility was a common thread?
Unbelievable. Yes. a level of humility. And I don't believe humility is really the right word. There's some negative connotations to humility. Modesty is another way to put it. It is a common characteristic. In fact, one thing I've often told people when they're trying to find people who might match the criteria of a leader I've described, I call it the sneaky praise test. And I would really urge you to try it. What I say is get a job candidate in front of you and just start lavishing them with praise. I mean, look at your resume, what you must have done. You must have been an amazing leader. You must have done this incredible thing. Like, these accomplishments are amazing. All of these captains that I've mentioned would get uncomfortable with that. They would either immediately defer to, well, I had a lot of help. I had great teammates. I had people around me. They would immediately try to defer credit, or they would just get visibly uncomfortable and start kind of fidgeting in their chair. It's a nice tell. If someone can accept a compliment, that's okay. It's not a negative. But if you're trying to find someone who has that natural, it's the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing to identify. There's no test to identify it. I'm trying to develop one. It's that quality where you care more about the team collectively than you care about yourself. It's the hardest thing to find. It's platinum gold. It is brilliant. And if you can pack your team with people like that, you're going to be better. That is one small way you might be able to home in on people who have that characteristic.
Okay, good. When you're inheriting a team with low morale, what's the first thing to focus on as a leader?
Service. The first thing you need to do is oftentimes the person who you need to look at the most talented person on the team. I found that superstars have a really hard time being great leaders because there's just too much being asked of them. What you need to do is you need to start going to these people and trying to figure out what their pain points are, what their problems are, and helping them solve them, helping them get through whatever's holding them back. And you start to do these little acts of service. You start to do small things that show that your commitment is to the collective and not to yourself. Over time, everybody loosens up. They realize that someone is going to handle the difficult leadership problems that come up, and they're free to focus more on what they want to focus, so they need to focus on. Superstars really need to be left alone usually to prepare to perform at that incredible level they perform at. And knowing that there's a leader who's got their back and is going to run into that burning building I mentioned, if something goes wrong, who's ultimately going to be responsible and who is always thinking of the collective instead of himself, it gives them enormous freedom. I think over time, people will immediately start to see that, and they'll be grateful. And they will show their gratitude in many ways by trying to help you, by trying to figure out the leadership contributions they can make. And pretty soon you've got a lot of people who are stepping out of their comfort zone, out of their lanes to try to make the group better. So that's really the first thing. You have to plunge in and just prove to people that you really care about the team as a whole and that you're willing to make personal sacrifices for it.
Okay. In regard to different cultures, how do the characteristics of great leadership vary with different cultures, like say Chinese versus American versus Australian, for instance?
I mean, this may sound simplistic, but I had a chapter set aside when I was writing the book for one about women and how women lead, because I assumed there would be differences in women's teams, and I assumed there would be cultural differences. I looked at many different nationalities. There's thousands of teams that I researched that are not in the book, and I assume there would be cultural differences. And there are some subtle ones. I think I spent a lot of time looking at cricket in India, and I found that there are some cultural traditions I think that make leadership slightly different, especially when it comes to dissent and when it comes to carrying the water, some of those things. But honestly, I don't believe there's any different. I believe that all teams are essentially teams. And I really think that the dynamics that work, and we're not talking about the dynamics that allow a team to become successful. We're not talking about breakthroughs here. We're talking about sustaining excellence. My book is about how do you maintain greatness? Once you've achieved it, how do you maintain it? That's really what I'm talking about. And I'm telling you, of the hundreds and thousands of teams and different venues, from the military to sports to business I've been to, people have told me every great team I know that has sustained excellence has had a leadership dynamic exactly like this. I do think it's universal. I think people are people and teams are teams. And I think these things have shown themselves to transcend cultural boundaries. You make some adjustments, of course, here and there, but I think the ultimate, the basic idea of what I'm talking about should translate anywhere.
Okay. We had another question. Somebody wrote, as a former UWM rugby player, I'm interested in hearing what you learned about the great leaders of the All Black teams you mentioned in your studies.
I could do a whole lecture on the All Blacks, and I could have written an entire book about it. There was a great book called Legacy by James Kerr, which gets at some of the culture. That is the greatest team culture of all time, and it's worth studying. I was amazed by this team. So for those who don't understand rugby, the All Blacks are the national team of New Zealand. New Zealand is a country of 4 million people. Okay, 4 million, that's the size of Metro Seattle. Now, they have dominated this international sport ever since it began, 150 years. In fact, there were 3 teams, there were multiple teams that could have made my list. There were 2 that, only 2 really in the end that made it, but the only team that had 2 different teams on the list. The culture that they've developed there is really unique, and it's a unique place. And I think a lot of it has to do with the humility and the this idea that you sweep the sheds, that no one is above anyone on a team. A lot of it gets the history of New Zealand, which is fascinating because there's the indigenous Maori people who have been incredible contributors to the rugby tradition. And then there were the European settlers, but there was not a colonial situation. It was a merger of these 2 cultures. And that's what makes it unique. And rugby was really the first thing that this nation did as a nation. It was really the first expression of what it meant to be unified. And the culture that came out of that is so strong that even when it's been terribly managed, and they've had some bad management above of New Zealand rugby, the players still understand, the culture is still there, and it's something that repeats itself over and over again. It's why they've been so successful. And I would suggest going online and Googling the haka, which is this famous Maori war dance that the All Blacks do before all their matches. And it speaks, I wrote about it in the book because it speaks to one of the qualities I didn't talk about, which is nonverbal motivation, the ability to motivate people through your actions and your commitment and passion. They are remarkable. And you know, I wish we could all spend some time with them, because I think the culture they've developed is one that will make any team better.
Okay. When interviewing applicants, what should you look for to try to identify a potential leader?
You know, I mentioned that first thing, the tendency to deflect praise and to single out others and to talk about contributions with others. That's definitely something to look for. What I found, and you know, I've spent a lot of time, especially in the NFL, with the team that I work with, looking at interviews and looking at people in the draft and trying to assess their leadership potential. And that's helped a lot in this process. And one thing that I've also noticed is that when great leaders talk about leadership, they talk about other people. They talk about themselves. They don't talk about the qualities that make them a leader. They talk about their strategy and how they interact with others. So you'll hear a lot of talk of engagement and how they engage with other people. That's very important as well. There's also there's a little bit of edge. The hardest thing to find that I've found in a great leader is that edge. I think we're all talk a lot about servant leadership, and I think there's a problem in that, and that we think that your ultimate job is to serve. But these captains had an edge to them, and they had the ability to push back, and they had the ability to be difficult and tough at times as well. Finding people who understand how to dissent and how to introduce conflict in a team constructively is the hardest thing. I would ask people in very detailed terms about a conflict they had with their boss or with their teammates, or in something where they got into a disagreement, and really listen closely to how they handled it, because it's an art form. And it's very hard to find people who are good at diffusing conflict, introducing conflict in a productive way that helps the team without hurting people's feelings, without alienating people, without creating a toxic culture. So that's another thing I would really key on.
Okay, great. And one last question. How do you deal with star individual contributors who refuse to collaborate with the rest of the team?
Yeah, you give them one last chance. The last chance is you have to find a captain like the one that I've described. I'm often called in by teams who have this exact problem. They have a superstar who wants to be the leader and expects to be the leader, and nobody on the team wants that person to be the leader. Nobody on that team thinks they have the right leadership capabilities. I see this a lot, and there's two ways it's going to go. I mean, the first way is you've got a really kind of toxic person who is just not capable of playing with others. And frankly, they should go play golf or an individual sport, right? Something where they don't have to collaborate with others. But that's pretty rare. What usually happens is that when you as the manager pick someone to lead the team who is not the obvious choice, not the best player, not the superstar, but has those qualities that I've described, and it cares about the team more than themselves, you will see a funny thing happen. If you lay out all those 18 roles in front of the entire team, people will realize you can't do all of that. And a superstar in particular sometimes will say, I can't lead, I can't do this, I can't do all these things. I need to be me. I need to go practice. I need to spend time working on my craft and doing what I need to do to produce those great numbers. So what usually happens is you kind of diffuse that person because they understand that the leader is there to help, and that they're taking the burdens of leadership off of them, allowing them to contribute as they can and as they want to, as opposed to having to rush in and deal with every situation. Most superstars are bad leaders, and they get frustrated because they feel like they're letting things go. They're not getting to things they need to get to. So what usually happens is that person will start to come into the fold. They'll start to appreciate that person who's been chosen as the leader, and they will start to perform better. And everyone will feel a little bit of ability to relax. They'll contribute to leadership as they can, but they know they have that person at the center who's ultimately responsible. So those are the two ways it can go. And, I think you just have to bite the bullet. I often tell coaches, maybe you're going to have a bad year. Maybe people are going to be worried about this. Maybe they're going to be turned off. But, go find, even if that person's an underclassman, in college, sophomore, make that person your captain. Send that message about what you value in leadership. It will pay off over time because you'll create the right culture. You may suffer in the short term, but you may not.
Okay, great. A lot of insight today. So, wish we had more time, but unfortunately we are out of time. But I want to thank you again for discussing your book, The Captain's Class, and just, diving in, giving us so much insight.
Thank you, Julia. It's a real pleasure.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.